Aphrodite was connected with warfare through her union, her affair with Ares, the god of war. And they were two famous lovers. Aphrodite wasn't actually married to Ares. She was married to Hephaestus, or Vulcan, the god of the forge. But she had this flaming affair with Ares, the war god. And the question is, why are these two always getting together? It's the fury of their mutual passions which made them two gods that were beyond the control of all the other gods. And as the saying goes, that every lover is a soldier on a campaign.
Thus, early Greek writings conveyed life's everyday lessons. And yet, some of the works reflected a blatantly sexist attitude towards women. One example is the story of Hippolytus.
He despised women, he despised female sexuality, he was chaste, pure. We'd send him to a psychiatrist, but pure as the snow. His stepmother's nurse, handmaid, went to Hippolytus and told Hippolytus that his stepmother was in love with him. Hippolytus was appalled. He was horrified.
When Greek men got together at the drinking parties, at the symposia, we know that they told stories, that they produced poetry, which made fun of women. In early Greek culture, women were seen as consumers of men's effort. The man had to farm, the woman simply consumed the effort, stayed at home, cooked, and was always on the man's back. And there's a strong misogynistic strain in Greek literature all the way through the 5th and the 4th century.
And so, great dramas and comedies unfolded in amphitheaters throughout the land, with all male casts playing the roles of gods as well as goddesses, mortal men as well as women. But the Greeks were not the only ones absorbed by stories of deities and heroes. Others were watching too. Far to the west, across the Mediterranean, a great new empire was being born. The Greek gods and goddesses, like classical Greece itself, would know the ravages of time and change. As functioning deities, they would eventually slip into the mists of history. And yet, they have not completely disappeared.
Even though they're not part of our religion, we still need these stories. They're wonderful, richly suggestive tales about how the world works and what we are as human beings. Generation after generation of modern students love and are fascinated by these myths. And I think that springs from something we all have in us, which is a desire to make stories, a need to understand the world by making stories about it.
Greek mythology has transcended the centuries, coming down to us not only from the great poets and playwrights, but through the conduits of many other cultures. One of the first was Rome, far to the west. It absorbed much of what Greece had to offer.
The Romans discovered Greek religion really in the 3rd century BC and began to make a bigger deal of it than it had been before. We know that there had been cultural contact for a long time, but there was a kind of prestige to the Greeks that the Romans felt they didn't have. And so they took over, really, the Olympian system and aligned their own local gods with more recognizable, high-status Greek gods.
In adopting the gods of the Greeks, the Romans imbued the pantheon of deities with distinctly Roman characteristics. The first priority was to assign them Roman names.
Zeus became Jupiter in their terms. Ares became Mars. Athena became Minerva. And when I say became, I mean that they had these gods existing already, Minerva, Mars, Jupiter, but they now aligned them in a new way that said, yes, we're part of a continuum of culture with the higher status Greeks.
Other gods adopted by the Romans included Hera, who became known as Juno. Poseidon was renamed Neptune. Hades re-emerged as Pluto. Aphrodite would forever be immortalized as the goddess Venus. And so the Greek pantheon to large extent became the Roman pantheon. As mighty Rome developed into an empire, it eventually occupied a little-known, dusty corner of the Middle East called Judea. Here the Hebrews clustered around their capital city, Jerusalem, where a new religion was being born. Following the crucifixion of Christ, word rapidly spread of his teachings. Even Christianity found connections in Greek and Roman philosophies, particularly through the apostle Paul.
We know that Paul was educated in Greco-Roman terms. He quotes Euripides at least several times in his epistles. Later on, notions that had developed in Platonism especially became crucial in the ways in which early Christians tried to make their religion more understandable to a highly educated class in the Greco-Roman world. In the Orthodox Church, even today, the Greek Christian Church, you still see some of the mysticism that you can identify in the works of Plato in the 4th century BC.
The Christian belief that Jesus was the Son of God, yet born of a mortal woman, also resonated with the early Greeks.
Because Greek religion was completely comfortable with the notion of gods interacting with human women, I think it helped in the spread of Christianity at an early period that a narrative like that was at its core. And so we'll never know cause and effect, and I certainly don't want to attribute early Christianity wholly to the Greeks, but it helped that the groundwork was laid.
Despite the enormous cast of divinities that ruled over the Greeks, just a few centuries before Christ was born, a new idea sprang up among the people: the notion of the existence of only one true God.
The Greek world shifted towards monotheism, I would say, sometime around the 400s and 300s BC, with the advent of philosophy, and philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, who were skeptical of the Greek religion the way it was written in mythology, but they did believe in some supreme force, some supreme all-good, all-knowing kind of power.
This movement toward monotheism in ancient Greece did not go unnoticed by the Apostle Paul. One day in Athens, Paul found himself addressing Greek citizens from atop the Areopagus, a hill that was a meeting place for a council of noblemen.
But Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, "Ye men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are too superstitious. For passing by and seeing your idols, I found an altar also on which was written, To the unknown God. What therefore you worship without knowing it, that I preach to you. God who made the world and all things therein, and hath made of one all mankind, to dwell upon the whole face of the earth." Acts 17:22.
One of the most potent forces that shaped Greek thinking was an awareness of sin. But 2,000 years ago, the concept of sin meant something very different than the beliefs held by the early Christians.
The Greek word for sin, the closest one, is a word that means to miss the mark, to err, to go wrong. Now, what does that mean? To sin If you go too high, it means that you're stepping beyond human limitations. If you go too low, it means that you're not living up to your fulfillment. And so for the Greeks, a sin was really not fulfilling who you are.
Though separated from us by untold millennia, the great pageantry of gods, goddesses, and heroes, of muses, fates, and graces, of soaring accomplishments and bitter defeats, is as significant today as it was to the ancient Greeks.
The interesting thing about the Greeks at that period who venerated these gods, but they gave to the gods the attitude also of human beings. There was the fighting, there was the jealousy, there was the adultery, there was the happiness, there was the truth, there was the peace. There were all the things that were going on in everyday's life of the human beings was also associated with the gods. And I think that is part of the reason why these things have survived all these centuries in the minds of people and identified in the way the Greeks think even today.
Greek myths is a whole body of narratives. Say something very complicated about the world. They speak to a kind of optimism and a kind of pessimism at the same time. Greek myth as a whole really does tell us through a lot of exemplary stories, a lot of different things about the nature of reality, the nature of life, what's important, what we ought to care about.
One of the major lessons is that to read any of these stories, which are timeless treatments of big human questions of personal morality versus the morality of the state and laws that are imposed, and how do you negotiate these very difficult questions of the best behavior as a citizen in the state, those are addressed by Greek myths and by Greek legends. And you are left with this feeling that we don't know really what these gods are or who they are. But we know there's some force out there. There's some huge force that's controlling our lives, and that we have to keep an open mind to what that force is doing. That's why the Greeks can speak across 3,000 years of history and tell us some questions, if not the answers, to some of the most perturbing eternal questions in the world.
There was another world here once, and the gods and goddesses and people who lived here still haunt the landscape. Their stories still travel across time. As long as people seek a deeper understanding of themselves and their world, ancient Greece lives on.
All ye other gods of this great place, grant to me that I be made beautiful in my soul within, and grant that all my external possessions be in peaceful harmony with my inner man, with myself. Plato.